Power Hour. Coal. Oil. Natural gas. Power Hour, the show where today's top energy experts break down today's top energy issues. No sound bites, no talking points, no nonsense, no BS, no softball questions, no vagueness, just in-depth analysis and ruthless clarity. Power Hour. Here's your host, Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. This week, we're going to be talking with one of the, what we can call, rising stars in the challenge to climate catastrophism. Now, she is a long-established climate scientist, so she's not any kind of new graduate or anything like that. But in the last, at least in my viewing, 5 or so years, Judith Curry, a climate scientist, has become extremely public about many of the flaws and problems in the practice of modern climate science, and she has given some really fascinating analysis of what's going on, what's behind it, how to fix it. Now, recently she has been talking about and writing about something that I think is truly horrific, even by the corrupt standards of many people in the modern climate science establishment, which is the use of racketeering / anti-mafia laws to prosecute either climate scientists who dissent from catastrophism or companies who fund research dissenting from catastrophism or companies who promote fossil fuels. Just a whole bunch of things which really go to show how much this field has devolved. So it's one thing for an outsider to say that, it's another thing for an insider to say that. I think you'll really enjoy what Dr. Curry has to say. So we will be joined by her on the other side. Enjoy.
Power Hour, because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
We are joined now by Dr. Judith Curry, professor and former chair of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Georgia Tech, president of Climate Forecast Applications Network, and proprietor of the blog Climate, etc. Dr. Curry, welcome to Power Hour.
Well, it's a pleasure to join you today.
All right. Well, you've become more and more prominent over the years, at least in terms of my reading and hearing. And you have one of these interesting journeys where, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you went from sort of a more mainstream, conventional, accepted opinion on some of these climate issues to an opinion that gets you a lot of flack from a lot of people. So I, and I'm sure the listeners, would just kind of love to hear your arc of how you got involved in climate science and then how you became this, I'd say, progressively notorious figure in certain circles.
Well, when I started my graduate research in the 1970s, I was working on issues related to what's going on in the Arctic. And so I wasn't really considering myself a climate scientist at that time, but things in the Arctic quickly became, very relevant to climate change, and I became more engaged in climate research. And I was comfortably ensconced in the ivory tower until 2005. In fact, September 2005. If you recall, this is the time of Hurricane Katrina, and through a sheer fluke, I was a co-author on a paper about hurricanes and global warming that ended up being published 2 weeks after Hurricane Katrina hit. Okay, so there was a massive amount of publicity, and although, human cause of this was not really a big part of the paper, that became the big part of the story, and everybody wanted to know, are humans causing hurricanes to become more intense? And so I and my co-authors, we hadn't been involved in the public debate on climate change. We figured out, well, how are we going to handle this? And at that point, we made a decision that it was the responsible thing to do was to support the IPCC consensus. This was, a huge effort undertaken by hundreds of our colleagues, over multiple years to do this assessment report. And whether we agreed or not with everything in it, we felt it was the responsible thing to do to support the consensus. So, I had a lot of media interviews for a few years during that period, and we were supporting the climate consensus. I got burned by a misquote in the Wall Street Journal. I said, okay, I've had enough. I've done my part. My 15 minutes turned into, months and years. Okay, I'm done, so I wasn't doing any more interviews. But I started participating in the climate blogosphere. I was spending some time commenting on various blogs, and I landed on one of the skeptical blogs, Steve McIntyre's blog, Climate Audit. And I started engaging with them, and I had some very interesting discussions. Some of those people were very intelligent and very interested in digging into the data and interested in the details, etc. So I was, pleasantly surprised. So I was on the front lines. I don't know if you remember ClimateGate in 2009.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
And we've had Ross McKittrick on the show. So
oh my, okay, wonderful. Okay, so I was on the front lines when that broke, and my immediate reaction was, oh my gosh, what an enormous black eye this is on climate science. So I was trying to speak up to try, okay, we need to do better. Okay, we need to be more transparent. We need to make data available. We need to do a better job of understanding and characterizing uncertainty. And we need to engage with skeptics. We can't just demonize them. And most of all, we should not, we need to play by the rules. We shouldn't try to, to sabotage the peer review process or sabotage individuals we don't like or try to bypass the rules of the IPCC. So, I thought these were motherhood and apple pie kind of statements and that other scientists would be joining me, but silence. In fact, I was...
So just, Dr. Curry, in what forum were you making these views known when you say that people were silent? Was it private?
Okay. Okay, what I did is I posted a blog post on climate audit. Okay. That was the first thing, got attention. And then I posted another one, and Andy Revkin at New York Times picked that one up. And then this started to get some attention, and then I published some other ones, and it was picked up by the Physics Today journal. And so I was, getting more and more attention. And my concern, while I was going through this, and the way I saw my colleagues react, nobody was trying to make things right, and all of a sudden I became the bad guy. And the more I looked at this and thought about it and saw all the sausage making that went into creating this consensus, the more I thought, oh, this is, why should I be supporting this, suborning my own judgment, in favor of this consensus. So I said, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to take a look myself and dig into every little thing myself and make my own judgments. So I started doing this, and part of the story of this episode became me. Scientific American did like a 6-page spread in 2010 on me. I think the title was Climate Heretic Judith Curry Turns on Her Colleagues. Okay. So, people were really upset that I was speaking out and engaging with skeptics, talking to people like Ross McKittrick and Steve McIntyre. And so I quickly got sort of ostracized and pushed into the other camp. And in 2010, I started my own blog, Climate Etc., judithcurry.com, so I could document, my explorations into trying to understand this. And uncertainty was a major theme of the blog in the early days, and it still is. And I had this whole series of posts, the so-called Uncertainty Monster series of posts that I think was quite provocative and made people think, but, talking about uncertainty really plays into the Merchants of Doubt meme, and they said, oh, she's one of them, one of these terrible people that's trying to deny science and trying to stop action to mitigate climate change, neither of which is true. So, I, have continually been ostracized, and now people are coming around to agreeing with much of what I've had to say, but I'm still ostracized by a certain segment of the community, and it's definitely hurt me professionally. So I've decided, well, I need a new peer group. So I've found a new group of people to interact with, people from other fields, people from other walks of life that I'm engaging with, in some cases collaborating with on publications, going to workshops and meetings well outside my field. And so I've broadened out into some very interesting directions, and my former peers seem pretty irrelevant at the moment. So I'm off and running sort of in a new career direction through this fluke of ClimateGate, really.
Wow, that's an amazing story, and I think that there's so many issues that are raised by that we can go into. So one thing that occurs to me is that at the beginning of the interview, I gave your different titles, but I think particularly most relevant is your title of professor at a university. And what I'm thinking of is what would have happened and what would have been the incentive system had a younger Judith Curry, who wasn't yet tenured, let alone full professor at a major university, what would happen to a younger version of you who had the exact same thing happen and started having these doubts? What would she come up against, and how would it affect her career?
Well, I received many emails from the kind of person that you described saying, thank God somebody is speaking up. I can't speak up because of XYZ. I'm a government employee. I have a mortgage and 3 young kids. I can't afford to jeopardize my job. And on it went. So there were any number of people who, wish they could speak out, but didn't want to jeopardize their employment. And it's really become, at university, Georgia Tech is relative, I'm in a red state in the southeast U.S. It's not like being in California or the Northeast or whatever. So it's a somewhat friendlier environment at Georgia Tech, but it's still not. And a lot of the engineers at Georgia Tech really like what I'm saying, but a few of the people in my own department really, really don't like what I'm saying. So, there's been a big mixed reaction, and sort of my administrative career at Georgia Tech is sort of over, largely because of these positions, I believe. So, yeah, I've been very lucky to be tenured and fairly senior, where if I had to retire, I could afford to retire. But young scientists are not in this position, and academia is becoming less and less a place for academic freedom and a fair and honest place for an open debate. It's becoming pretty politically correct in some ways that are very unfortunate.
One aspect that I find particularly disturbing that came up as you were giving your account of your own story is the binary nature of how people are taught to think about a predictive science in many cases. That is, there's either you agree with, quote, the science or not. And yet a lot of your work seems to be about, or at least your public work about, well, I disagree with you on the extent of climate sensitivity. But it seems like within a science, particularly where it's predictive and you don't have exact 2.1x or something like that, this is just in the nature of things. So how do they justify saying, you're sort of with us or against us, when a proper science of this kind would necessarily have a wide range of values attributed?
It's no longer about science. It's about policy. It's speaking consensus to power. Okay, as a result of this consensus, it's politically powerful. There's lots of funding. They have seats at very important tables. People have made their careers on that. And here I come along saying, oh, but all this is much more uncertain than you're making it out to be. And I threaten them. Okay. As far as I can tell, that's what's going on. It's just this whole social contract between the scientists and the policymakers. And, someone like me comes along and I'm threatening that.
I want to dig into that a bit because I don't think people realize how extensive that is, and I like the way you put it because with politicians there is a certain binary nature to it. It's can we pass our policy or not? Can we get what we want at Paris or not? And the way they like to portray science is all the scientists gave us a thumbs up, or 97% of the scientists gave us a thumbs up implicitly on our policy. Whereas if you have a continuum of views within a science, that's very messy and doesn't play well politically. And it seems like one of the sins of many of the scientists is not to acknowledge the complexity and of views and plausible views, and letting the consensus, the sort of the political type scientists, the consensus makers, make these absolute binary statements, and to just be quiet, even though they know full well that it doesn't represent the true breadth of reasonable opinion.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very unfortunate situation. And all of this is enforced by the professional science societies, nearly all who have put out some sort of a climate change policy statement, urgent action needed. Okay, that has nothing to do with science in terms of what kind of action that is needed or whether or not it's urgent.
Thank you for saying that. It's insane, but they act like it's logical for the American Physical Society to come up with a political conclusion.
Exactly. And this, apart from being wrong, think of what this does. It gives journal editors, the main function of these professional societies is to publish journals. So when you see a statement like that, that gives journal editors carte blanche to just reject or not even review papers that question the consensus. Okay, and this is a very big concern about, how, apart from all the other biases that can, come into science, to have an explicit, filter at the journal editor level enforcing politically correct views is a very dangerous situation for science.
I'm curious with these letters that you get, because I hate the term skeptic, but every non-catastrophist scientist I've spoken to on these issues has said, I get tons and tons of letters and notes from my colleagues, and every time we put out something, we get these. And yet the number of people who speak out who have any prominence is very, very small. Is there any way to get more of the people to speak out? Because it seems like an I am Spartacus situation, where if you had enough stories that all came out on the same day, people might think, wow, there's a real climate of fear here. There's something wrong.
I don't know how to break this log jam. I think in the U.S., if the Republicans win the presidency, I think this would shake this up. I'm wondering, if the funding priorities went to funding more research on natural climate variability, would the rats desert the sinking ship and follow the money? Or do they really have the conviction, to carry through, pushing for the other thing? So, I just don't know. There's a lot of complex dynamics and a lot of different things going on. So I'm not sure how all this is going to play out. The other thing that can happen, but in another 5 or 10 years, if we see this, global warming to continue to be slow, and this might happen, we're looking to see a shift to the cold phase of the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation sometime in the 2020s. A lot of solar scientists are predicting solar cooling towards mid-century, so it's possible that we could see a continued slowdown of the warming. And this is something that will also give pause. Although there are so many different temperature data sets out and shenanigans with the data, it's hard to what to believe. But the one thing that I will say about all these different surface temperature data sets is that the error bars that they've assigned to those numbers are way too small. There's a whole lot of other things that need to be investigated before we can think that the error bars on the global average temperatures are order of 1/10 of a degree or even less.
I think that's worth drilling into for a second, because I think there's a perception of when people see these global mean temperature anomaly graphs and they hear about these surface measurements, that it's as if, like, right now in the room I'm in and my condo in Laguna Beach, I have a temperature measurement in this room. Now, granted, it's not that precise; it's just within a degree. But hypothetically, I could have one much more precise. I think people think the equivalent, when we see these temperature numbers, it's the equivalent of there's somehow one perfect thermometer that knows the exact temperature, versus understanding how these things are constructed. So could you talk a little bit about how they're constructed and why the error bar is significant?
Well, the measurements themselves are non-trivial, especially in the ocean. What you really want is over land, you measure surface air temperature at a height of about 6 feet, and over the ocean, you're measuring a surface temperature or something, as much as 10 or 15 feet below the surface. And so that there's a murky definition even of what the surface really is, and the temperatures can vary quite a bit, and there's different methods of making the measurements. And there's biases. Ships give different measurements than buoys do, so you have to adjust to eliminate bias. And then the satellites, have different temperatures again, and there's all this adjustment and bias adjustment, and then unless it's a satellite, you actually don't have global coverage, so you need to make some assumptions about what's going on in the areas where you don't have any data, and on it goes. So there's all these assumptions that you have to make, and so even if you had a perfect measurement, it's just at a point, and the globe is a pretty big place. And even if at your own house you go out in the front yard and measure the temperature, and you go out in the backyard and you measure the temperature, and it might be rather different depending on, which is in the sun, which is in the shade, at what kind of ground cover, whether you have a big blacktop driveway in the front and grass in the back, etc. So all these little things make non-trivial differences in the temperature, and trying to make sense, and turn this into a global average is not real easy. No one questions that overall temperature is increasing, but by how much, and how to interpret some of the variations, and how to interpret the disagreements among different data sets. There's a lot of things we don't understand. And the thing that's been on the table is that since about 1998, the temperatures haven't been warming as fast as expected by the climate models. This is causing people to question the climate models. And then people who like the climate models are questioning the data. And so it's a good thing for everybody to be questioning everything. But, claims that we can measure globally average surface temperature to within 1/10 of a degree, I think it's rather a joke.
As you were saying that, I thought, so these are all difficult enterprises. I mean, certainly modeling the climate system, I would say, is beyond difficult, and getting accurate surface temperature measurements and knowing what to do with them is difficult. And it just occurred to me that if I was a researcher on either of those issues, and I turned in either surface temperature measurements that made it seem like there was much less severe warming than people thought, or a model that predicted much less severe warming, I cannot imagine how that would be good for my career, even if I was right.
To some extent. It depends on who you are. Okay. Now the guys who measure atmospheric temperature from satellites, this way you get a global coverage, John Christie and Roy Spencer, okay, that they're frequently called deniers, skeptics, or whatever. People don't like the data set. They have shown no warming at all since 1998. Big spike in temperatures in 1998, and then it dropped back down, and it's been pretty flat ever since. So they get called lots of nasty names for doing, I think, some very good work, just because we can't understand why the temperatures in the atmosphere should be different than the temperatures of the surface doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong or they're deniers or they're whatever. So that's an example of two scientists who frequently get the denier label for doing a lot of hard work, even winning NASA Special Achievement Awards for their research and everything. They get lots of nasty things are said about them.
Well, but even with those guys, I think there's a lucky anomaly in that we've had John Christie on the show, and I've talked to Roy Spencer before. You have those. To my knowledge, they are innovators, and that center at University of Alabama Huntsville is innovative, and they're some of the pioneers in this realm. And it's not as crowded seemingly, or it seems like they've been able to create this objective way of measuring things that's hard to corrupt. Versus, say, if I worked at, for Hansen or Gavin at NASA, and I had this other approach, it doesn't seem like it would be very welcome. And even as prominent as Hansen is or was, it's his funders, the government funders, are not going to be very happy if they come in with an "oops, we're wrong. There's not a crisis here." That's people are very invested in there being a crisis.
Well, I don't think the existence of a crisis rests on the surface temperature record. I mean, we've been warming, for over 300 years since, coming out of the little ice age. Why we've been warming for 300 years, why there was a big warming jump from 1905 to 1940. Nobody's really explained that satisfactorily. So just the warming itself, or a warmest year or whatever, is no particular reason to be alarmed. And if you're worried about, extreme weather events, hurricanes, flood, droughts, heat waves, things were much worse in the U.S. in the 1930s and the 1950s. And you'd never believe that to listen to the news reports today.
Yeah. I definitely didn't mean to imply that the current data, even as whatever, to the extent it's manipulated, justifies the conclusions. But any departure from the narrative casts doubt. So even the pause, as they call it, or at least the slowdown, that much has been made of that by people challenging the catastrophist narrative, and they have bent over backwards, I would say the absolute least, to come up with different interpretations to say why their basic narrative is still sound. And they're just gleeful when they can say, there's some report to the effect of, it turns out there was never any pause. But they're looking for that constantly. So it's just that any chink in the narrative is really fought off hard, at least in the public debate. I haven't been in the scientific trenches.
Well, in the scientific trenches, there's a lot of interesting work going on. It's stimulated a lot of good research on the ocean, what's going on with the oceans and how this is influencing global temperature and circulation patterns and stuff like that. So there's a lot of research, good research by prestige scientists, that can be woven into a rather skeptical narrative. But in the public debate, no, you still get people saying the pause didn't exist, the climate models are doing perfectly well, and so on and so forth, and it just isn't true.
I'm thinking again of the young person coming into the field. In fact, I have a friend who got a PhD in the field and decided not to go into it, and he told me that he just felt like if he actually said his views, he would get in a lot of trouble. And he was here on, I forget what it's called, but some sort of, he's from another country, So he felt like
Yeah.
his very residency would be at risk because he's here as a qualified climate scientist. And of course, if he challenges climate catastrophism, he's not a qualified climate scientist. I'm just wondering, are there any specific stories you can share about young people that you've heard from to give? Because people have no idea what goes on.
Yeah, I can share some stories, albeit anonymously, because I don't
Yeah. No, I
want to.
get. I
Okay,
don't want Joe Smith
okay.
from.
There's one that I can think of who was rather outspoken, even as a graduate student. He was involved in blogs and whatever, and he was, I guess, on the skeptical side. And when he graduated, he took a postdoc. And then when he started thinking about what he's going to do next, and what he was interested in a faculty position in universities, and he couldn't imagine a place where he would be happy, let alone where they would actually hire him. And he ended up in the private sector, still doing atmospheric science, and he's actually doing very well, certainly making a lot more money. Another example was a postdoc at one of the, prestige programs, and he wrote to me saying that he had come up, done a research study that showed that, most of this warming has really been caused by the oceans. And he said he was advised by his two postdoc mentors, don't publish this will be the end of your career. Not that they didn't like his paper, but they were just giving him a realistic read, of what it was like in the field. And my advice to him was to change the title of his paper and change the abstract so it was less sort of, in your face with, the headline conclusion, and try to get it published. And I encouraged him to stay in the field. The paper did get published, and it did get some pretty good press. And I think he's, working around this. And I think he's still in the field right now. But another story, someone who got his PhD and then just left the field for the financial sector, knowing that there is no way that the career he wanted in meteorology and atmospheric sciences was going to work for him because he wasn't buying the IPCC consensus. So he, it broke his heart to leave the field because he really loves all this stuff, but now he's working in the financial sector. So it's not a very friendly situation for scientists, particularly young scientists.
It reminds me of the situation that has occurred historically when you have a government-created monopoly in just a normal business, where if there's really only one business in a field and it's mandated, then that imposes a lot of difficulty on any free-thinking person in the field because they have to either toe the company line or they have to keep silent. But if they disagree, and certainly if they disagree publicly, they can get fired, versus a competitive system where there are lots of different institutions is totally different. I'm curious what you think of that analogy.
That's a good one. And I've just joined this group of social scientists who are trying to fight against this kind of, these knowledge monopolies and politically correct thinking at university.
That's
Again,
a good term, knowledge monopoly.
Right, and it's the group is called Heterodox Academy, heterodoxacademy.org. It's a new group, and we'll see how it evolves. But this is the kind of thing that they're trying to fight against. Apparently, it's rampant in the social science, in academic law schools, and so on. Not just in what I would, I'm the token environmental kind of scientist in this group. So I'm trying to educate them about some of the issues that we face, hoping that they'll stimulate some research related to the kind of environmental and climate change political correctness. But it's an issue all over across many different fields in universities. And it's a big problem because disagreement and diversity of perspectives is what really drives the field forward. It makes us question our beliefs and our interpretation of evidence, and it seeds the field with new ideas. And that's really important for scientific progress, and it's being stifled.
Well, that leads into a topic that you've written about recently, and I've been thinking about a lot recently. I'll probably write about soon. And just to give some background, there's this broad narrative that the evil fossil fuel industry is hiring shill scientists to manipulate the data and undercut the absolutely certain international consensus, and just and then recently there's been this proposal by a certain senator and then 20 self-proclaimed scientists who, actual scientists who I don't think are acting scientifically, to talk about using racketeering charges against this. And so I want to ask you about this in a second, but just for the record, for listeners, and I may have a different opinion than a lot of people, I would just say that I am absolutely in favor of the fossil fuel industry or any industry funding science. They should do it honestly and they should do it openly. But in particular, if you feel like someone else has a monopoly, no matter what your industry is, you should challenge it. And it's perfectly legitimate for a company who thinks that they have an important product and they think that the research is skewed against them to fund research. And people can take it with a grain of salt. If they want, they should take everything with a grain of salt. But I just think there's a certain narrative that, the fossil fuel industry shouldn't support, say, Willie Soon or whomever else. Of course, they're okay if it's the Kochs and they support Berkeley Earth if it comes up with conclusions that they like. But I just want to, for any listeners, because I haven't talked about this before, but anyway, I want to get to Dr. Curry. Can you give us just the background on this RICO thing? Because this is really a remarkable, in a negative way, development.
Okay, I'll start with a little bit of a broader perspective. A couple years ago, there was this report written called Big Oil Goes to College, and it talks about how much money oil companies were sending to colleges, mostly the prestige institutions, the Stanfords and so on. It was an enormous amount of money. I know Georgia Tech gets a lot of money from oil companies. We have a number of Georgia Power endowed chairs at Georgia Tech, for example. ConocoPhillips gives a lot of money to chemical engineering, and even one of the faculty members in earth and atmospheric sciences, and so on and so on. And this is viewed favorably by the university. In this era of declining federal research funds, universities are looking for industry support for research. And I think that's a really good thing. But it seems like the oil company is allowed to fund everything but climate research. Anytime there's any hint, and the oil companies aren't really funding climate research anymore. I was surprised to hear that Willie Soon was getting some money from Southern Company. I just didn't think that the oil companies and energy companies were funding climate research anymore, and I don't think they are to any considerable extent. If they're fighting climate change legislation, they're hiring lobbyists. They're not spending their money on climate researchers. So it's a fairly ludicrous thing. In 2 weeks, I'm giving a talk at some meeting of the CEOs of power companies in the eastern U.S., and they're paying my travel, and I'm going to talk to them about climate change. So, oops, I'm getting money from the energy sector. Horrors. Well, why shouldn't climate scientists go talk to this group of influential people in the energy sector? Of course, climate scientists should do that. Am I going to pay the $1,000 out of my own pocket for a hotel and airlines and everything else? Of course, I'm not. I'm going to ask them to support my travel, and that's the kind of thing that people say. Oh, she's in the pocket, of the oil industry. It's ridiculous. If the IPCC and whatever had been engaging with the energy sector and the oil companies right from the get-go and working with them and rather against them, I think this would have had a very different outcome rather than, starting off on day one in the 1990s, saying you guys are the enemy. Of course they're not the enemy. Everybody needs power and fuel. So it's sort of a ridiculous situation. Now, the RICO thing, you should have Naomi Oreskes on your show sometime. I don't know if she would agree, but she was the author of the book Merchants of Doubt, who, spun this story of how a few corrupt scientists helped support the tobacco industry, and some of those same scientists are now supporting, climate denialism and the oil companies. And it's a fairly ludicrous book, but the meme has really stuck somehow, and this link between, tobacco and now the oil companies and the climate skeptics are doing the same thing as what we saw in the tobacco. It's sort of, some people have found this convincing, and apparently these 20 scientists found Naomi Oreskes' Merchants of Doubt narrative convincing and said, oh, we need to stop this, and stick it to the oil companies, RICO, whatever, without apparently understanding. And I haven't talked to any of the 20 signatories, although my close colleague Peter Webster has spoken to several of them. I don't think any of them intended for this RICO thing to persecute people like me, but it's a logical inference because there were university scientists who got caught up in the tobacco RICO thing, and I was one of 7 scientists, in addition to Willie Soon, that was investigated by Representative Grijalva, who was going after, and he chose 7 people who had testified for the Republicans in recent congressional hearings. That was, I guess, the way we got selected. And we had to, all of our travel, all of our honorariums, all of our speaking engagements, all of our funding, they wanted emails and on and on and on. The implication that we were guilty of something. And none of us turned out to be guilty of anything, and the whole thing rather fizzled. But it's a black eye on our reputation. But you can see, you can tell which scientists would be drawn into any sort of a RICO investigation. It's the people who have been testifying for the Republicans, and that includes me. And the naivete of these scientists, apparently, it was Shukla was the instigator, who's, a fairly big name in climate research. He's been very successful, although with all of that government funding, it's hard to imagine how anyone wouldn't have been successful with all that funding. He thought, he wants to get more active in policy, and so he decided to support Senator Whitehouse's RICO kind of call, and he got some of his pals to sign on. Some of them apparently signed on, oh yeah, stick it to him, and others, just signed on to be a mate, or a colleague without really understanding what they were getting themselves into. But it's turned out to be, I think, an enormous black eye, particularly for Shukla, not to mention some of the other scientists who signed. So this saga is still playing out. But back to your original point, I think oil company funding of climate research would provide different perspective than the government-funded establishment view, and I think these different perspectives could help push the science forward. So I'm all in favor of oil company funding climate research. as long as it's disclosed and as long as the scientists are free to publish whatever they find, I think that would be a good thing, because they would fund presumably different topics and different ideas than what you can get funded by the government. So I think new perspectives are badly needed in the climate science debate, not to mention the policy debate. And if those could be seeded by oil companies or industry or whatever, I think that I agree that would be a good thing. But, any scientist at this point, and it's ridiculous because there's all sorts of scientists taking oil company funding to do research on alternative energy and the electric grid and air quality and who knows what other topics. And you don't see them getting any kind of being called nasty names. But if it were climate research, then it would be a terrible thing for a academic scientist to take oil company money, which is ludicrous. So, it's the way it is, and hopefully we can change it, and I'm trying to do what I can to change people's perspective on this, but I'm just one tiny voice. I have a few friends, but, it just makes no sense.
Well, I think you've, in the last couple of years, become one of the leading voices on this issue. So, and it's been a good development to see that, and particularly because you have a story that indicates intellectual honesty, versus having started with some position and just stuck with it dogmatically, come what may with the evidence. But you mentioned Naomi Oreskes as a potential guest, which made me gag inside. And so the issue is, but here's my issue with her and my issue with this narrative and what it made me think of when I saw this. Because there's one thing to say it's just unbelievably inappropriate that you would prosecute and or persecute scientists this way and instill a kind of climate of fear. But they're the narrative behind it is this merchants of doubt narrative. But the reality, and Oreskes is a perfect example of this, from everything I've seen, is that, as Robert Zubrin would say, there are these merchants of despair, merchants of fear, who have systematically misrepresented to the public what is and isn't known, and with what degree of certainty and with what magnitude about global warming. And Oreskes is a perfect example. She's one of the manufacturers of consensus. And looking at her work, I am unimpressed would be putting it mildly.
I agree with you there.
She's dishonest. So she is a merchant of manipulation. And I think that's the story. So I think there is an opportunity here to look at, hey, how should science be done here? What are who should be funding it? How should it be conducted? And in particular, how should it be reported? And and it's been very frustrating to me as a researcher who isn't an expert in the field, because it takes forever to find out who's telling the truth, because nobody is specific at all, and they like to use these vague things about consensus and global warming is real and all these meaningless statements. And if you try to figure out, well, how big a problem is there, if any, nobody wants to give it. So in my mind, I don't think RICO is the path, but I think we should have a public discussion of it, just as we should have had more of one on ClimateGate. And I think it's totally appropriate to discuss Michael Mann, for that matter. I saw on your website we'll link to your article, but it's really fascinating to see some of the scientists' defenses of themselves. And I think it was one of the scientists who just said as a throwaway, oh, well, you weren't very nice to Michael Mann, therefore we can do this. And I think if people look at that, Michael Mann refused to give information. It's legitimate to say you should give information. You should give information when you're doing government-funded things. So I think it's much worse than even they're doing this irrational thing to persecute scientists. I think that they have a lot of guilt to answer for, and I think it would be good for that to come out.
Oh, I agree. Well, Michael Mann. Well, you might want to interview Mark Stein.
Yeah, no, I'm trying. He's hard to track down. If Mark Stein, if you're listening, you're invited.
Michael Mann is suing Mark Stein for talking about the fraudulent hockey stick. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to talk about the fraudulent hockey stick, because a lot of people don't like it, think it's wrong, think it's shoddy science, think all sorts of shoddy things were done. And it's not unreasonable in the public debate to refer to the fraudulent hockey stick. And so, this lawsuit's been going on for 4 years. Mark Stein just published a book about Michael Mann and what other scientists have to say about him. And, I think Mark Stein was not a good choice for a person to sue or pick on. I think Michael Mann made a big mistake there. But, people are trying to silence debate and other opinions, and it's truly a travesty. You can understand why politicians might want to do it, but for scientists to do it is the most antithetical thing to science that I can imagine.
Well, I would just encourage listeners to Google at random any video by Judith Curry and any video by Michael Mann, and throw in Willie Soon for that matter, because he's just been getting so much flack. And though most of you are not professional scientists, nor am I, just look at the methodology by which they explain things and how careful they are. And I think you'll see, like, one group of people is generally very careful and explains, the different kinds of factors, including factors that might not make their view true, and the other side just bizarrely oversimplifies and misrepresents the issue. And I think that's one thing that really affected me, is just seeing how people conducted themselves and knowing that a scientist has this sacred obligation to communicate the truth and what he knows and what he doesn't know, or what she knows and doesn't know, to us, because we don't have access. And watching Michael Mann, well, listeners can judge for themselves, but I was underwhelmed would be an understatement. So I'm very grateful to you for your work. And I just ask, do you have any final closing statements that you'd like, or thoughts that you'd like to leave the listeners with?
Not really, other than just this, we've oversimplified the problem of climate change, and we've oversimplified the solution. And we need to push the restart button to try to get this on track, so we have a broader and more mature perspective on how to think about this problem and how to deal with it. It's just become, sort of cartoon simple, and policies are on the table that make no sense. They're politically and economically infeasible, and they would have a minuscule impact on the climate, even if successfully implemented. So, we need to push the restart button, reframe the problem, and really open up the dialogue. That's what I'm trying to do. I encourage you to visit my blog, Climate Etc., judithcurry.com, or follow me on Twitter at CurryJA.
Absolutely, and we will include all of those links with the show. Dr. Curry, thanks for your work, and thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks again to Dr. Curry for being on the show. One thing that strikes me with the scientists we have on this show who are challenging climate catastrophism is how much more rational they are in so many different ways than the catastrophists. And I think I indicated one of these during the interview. One is just that they actually explain things clearly and, just as important, I think, respectfully. So when Dr. Curry makes a point, she explains her reasoning. She gives the evidence. She doesn't say, I'm a climate scientist, therefore you should listen to me. I was the head of a department, therefore you should listen to me. Nor does she use jargon or try to cow you with her intelligence. It's just a clear explanation of both her view and about other views, including whatever rationale other people use and why she thinks that's wrong. And I've noticed this among other people in the show, like Richard Lindzen and John Christie. And it's so absent from most of the discussion, where people just say the debate is over and they won't even define the debate, how it was resolved, why it was resolved that way, how one side was refuted. And thus you have this spectacle of people who are just bizarrely overconfident in a viewpoint they can't even define, let alone understand, but they know that their tribe is supported by science with a capital S, and that's enough. So I thank Dr. Curry and the others for just showing us what it means to be a scientist and what it means to be a scientist who communicates with the public fairly and rationally and respectfully. And we need to demand that of all people in science who are getting involved in any kind of public issue. So that's my final thought on that. Again, thanks to Dr. Curry for being on the show, and check out her links on the website, and particularly the blog Climate, etc. is very, very active. All right, that is it for this week. If you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, email me at alex@industrialprogress.net. Make sure to sign up for the newsletter at industrialprogress.com. You can get the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, at moralcaseforfossilfuels.com, and follow us on Facebook or Twitter at, well, there's Alex Epstein, I Love Fossil Fuels, Center for Industrial Progress, and I Love Nuclear. So any or all of those, make sure to follow along. Lots of interesting stuff going on these days. Also, if you happen to work for an organization that books speakers, you can go to our page, industrialprogress.com/speaking, and see if you are interested in either booking me or one of our other people for a speech, including Dr. Pierre Desrochers, who's now a senior fellow at Center for Industrial Progress. He is a great speaker to have. All right. So we will be back next week with another great guest.